Imagine a city so magnificent that when Alexander the Great first laid eyes upon it, he wept. Not tears of joy, but tears of inadequacy, knowing that even with all his conquests, all his power, all his ambition, he could never build anything to rival what stood before him. This was Babylon, humanity's first true megacity, a place so advanced, so sophisticated, so utterly beyond comprehension that it would take us 4,000 years to build anything comparable. Yet today, when we think of ancient wonders, we think of Egypt's pyramids, Rome's Colosseum, Greece's Parthenon. Babylon, the city that invented urban civilization itself, has been almost entirely forgotten. Tonight, we're going to change that. We're going to walk through the streets of old Babylon, not as tourists, not as conquerors, but as witnesses to the birth of everything we call modern life. The story begins not with Babylon's glory, but with its impossible location. The southern plains of Mesopotamia, between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, were perhaps the worst place on earth to build a city. There were no stones for construction, no timber for building, no metal for tools. The summer heat reached levels that would kill an unprepared person in hours. The rivers flooded unpredictably, destroying everything in their path. Winter brought freezing winds from the mountains. There were no natural defenses, no mountains, no forests, nothing to hide behind when enemies came. And yet, it was precisely here, in this hostile, resource-poor landscape, that humans built the greatest city the ancient world had ever seen. The Babylonians arrived in this unforgiving place around 4,000 years ago, part of a Semitic people called the Amorites. They looked at the same landscape that had defeated countless others and saw something different. They saw two rivers carrying endless water. They saw flat land that could be shaped to human will. They saw clay, infinite clay, waiting to be transformed. And most importantly, they saw the ruins of older civilizations, the Sumerians and Akkadians, whose knowledge had been written down and preserved on clay tablets. The Babylonians didn't just settle this land. They studied it, learned from every failure of those who came before, and then they built something unprecedented. The first thing they needed was water control, and here the Babylonians displayed a genius that wouldn't be matched for millennia. They dug canals, not simple ditches, but precisely engineered waterways that stretched for hundreds of miles. These canals had to maintain exact gradients. Too steep and the water would erode the channels. Too shallow and the water would stagnate. They built these without modern surveying equipment, without levels, using nothing but keen observation and mathematical calculation. The main canal of Babylon was over 300 miles long, feeding water to millions of date palms, countless grain fields, and the city itself. But the rivers didn't just bring water, they brought silt, rich with nutrients, constantly replenishing the soil. The Babylonians learned to read the rivers, to predict their moods, to work with them rather than against them. Then came the problem of building materials. There was no stone, so the Babylonians invented something better. They took clay, mixed it with straw and water, shaped it into rectangular molds, and baked it in the scorching sun. These weren't primitive mud bricks. Babylonian bricks were standardized, each one identical in size and shape, designed to interlock perfectly. They discovered that firing the bricks made them nearly indestructible, able to withstand floods, heat, and time itself. But fired bricks required fuel, and there was no wood, so they used reeds, which grew abundantly along the riverbanks. Every problem had a solution, every obstacle became an opportunity. By 1800 BC, under King Hammurabi, Babylon transformed from a regional town into the capital of an empire. Hammurabi was not primarily a warrior, though he could fight when needed. He was an administrator, perhaps the greatest the ancient world had produced. He understood that empires aren't built just through conquest, but through systems, through laws, through creating a framework where millions of people could live together in relative peace. Hammurabi's Code, carved onto a massive stone stele, contained 282 laws, covering everything from property rights to marriage contracts to criminal punishment. We often focus on the harsh punishments, the famous eye for an eye, but we miss the revolutionary aspect. These laws applied to everyone. The king himself was bound by them. For the first time in human history, law existed independent of the ruler's whim. But laws mean nothing without a city worthy of them, and this is where Babylon's true genius emerged. The city that Hammurabi began building would eventually cover over 3,000 acres, home to perhaps 200,000 people at its peak. To understand how staggering this was, consider that in the same era, most human settlements held fewer than 1,000 people. London wouldn't reach Babylon's size until the medieval period, more than 2,000 years later. Paris, Rome, Athens, at their ancient peaks, were villages compared to Babylon. The city was protected by walls that remain difficult to comprehend even today. The inner walls were double-layered, each layer 11 miles long, making a rectangular circuit of 44 miles around the city. These weren't simple barriers. They were 40 feet thick, so wide the chariots could race along the top. They rose 85 feet high, taller than most buildings in the ancient world. Every 100 yards stood a watchtower, rising even higher, giving defenders views for miles in every direction. The walls were made of fired brick, millions upon millions of bricks, each one made by hand, each one fired in kilns, each one laid with precision. Outside the inner walls lay outer walls, creating a defensive zone where any attacking army would be trapped in a killing field, with no cover, no escape. 8 gates pierced these massive walls, each one a fortress unto itself, each one dedicated to a god. The most famous was the Ishtar Gate, dedicated to the goddess of love and war. This wasn't a simple opening, it was a processional way, decorated with blue glazed bricks, each brick enameled with images of lions, bulls, and dragons in yellow and brown. Hundreds of these animals lined the passage, creating an effect that ancient visitors described as overwhelming, as if the beasts might step off the walls at any moment. The gate itself rose over 40 feet high, decorated with over 120 relief sculptures of lions and dragons. When the sun struck the glazed bricks, the entire structure seemed to glow, to pulse with inner light. Through the Ishtar Gate ran the processional way, a street like no other in the ancient world. It was over half a mile long, paved with massive limestone blocks imported from mountains hundreds of miles away. The edges were lined with red and white stone, creating a pathway that even in darkness could be followed. Lions, over 120 of them, were molded in relief on the walls flanking the street. These weren't decorative, they were warnings. Babylon was the city of lions, and those who entered came under the protection and power of the lion goddess. The processional way led to the heart of Babylon, the temple complex of Esagila and its associated ziggurat, Etemenanki. The name Etemenanki means the temple of the foundation of heaven and earth, and the structure lived up to its name. This was the famous Tower of Babel from biblical accounts, though the reality was far more impressive than myth. The ziggurat rose in 7 stages, each one smaller than the one below, creating a stepped pyramid that reached 300 feet into the sky. At its base, it measured 300 feet on each side, a perfect square. The entire structure was faced with fired brick, glazed in different colors for each level. The bottom was black for the underworld, the second was white for Earth, then came red for Mars, gold for Jupiter, yellow for Saturn, silver for the moon, and at the very top, blue for heaven, crowned with a temple where only the king and high priests could enter. Climbing the ziggurat was a spiritual journey. The stairs wrapped around the outside, forcing pilgrims to circle the structure 7 times before reaching the top. This wasn't an architectural limitation, it was intentional, a meditation in stone. Each level representing a stage of spiritual ascent. At the top sat a temple with a solid gold table weighing over 25 tons, golden furniture, and a bed where, according to Babylonian belief, the god Marduk would visit his earthly dwelling. The priestess chosen to sleep in this temple was considered the most honored person in Babylon, though what actually occurred during those nights remains one of history's enduring mysteries. The temple complex wasn't just religious. It was the economic heart of the empire. The temples owned vast estates, employed thousands of workers, and operated as banks, lending money at interest, storing grain, managing trade. The priests kept meticulous records on clay tablets, tracking every transaction, every loan, every deposit. These tablets, tens of thousands of them, survived into modern times, giving us an unprecedented window into ancient economics. We can read the price of barley in 1700 BC. We can see mortgage contracts, divorce settlements, slave sales, business partnerships. Babylon wasn't just a religious capital, it was history's first true commercial hub. The residential areas of Babylon reveal the society far more sophisticated than we typically imagine for ancient peoples. Houses were built around central courtyards, providing privacy and shade. The wealthy had 2-story homes with decorated reception rooms, private chapels, and bathrooms with sophisticated drainage systems. Clay pipes carried water from central cisterns to individual houses. Waste was collected in cesspits, lined with fired brick, then regularly emptied by workers who sold the waste as fertilizer. The streets were paved, not with dirt, but with fired brick, and were regularly cleaned. There were public squares, markets, taverns, and inns for travelers. The city was divided into neighborhoods, each with its own character, its own patron god, its own local administrators. The Babylonians were obsessed with cleanliness and order, something unusual for ancient cities. They bathed regularly, sometimes multiple times per day. They used soap made from plant ashes and animal fat. They wore clean clothes, changed daily for the wealthy, and had laundries where professionals cleaned garments. They brushed their teeth with frayed twigs and powdered clay. They used cosmetics, perfumes, and oils not just for vanity, but for protection against the harsh sun and dry air. Archaeologists have found thousands of small ceramic bottles that once held these precious substances, evidence of a culture that valued personal hygiene and appearance. Women in Babylon held surprising freedoms and rights compared to most ancient civilizations. They could own property independently of their husbands. They could conduct business, sign contracts, appear in court as witnesses or plaintiffs. They could divorce their husbands under certain circumstances. A woman's dowry remained her property throughout her marriage, and if divorced, she took it with her. Wealthy women could become priestesses holding significant religious and economic power. Some women ran successful businesses, owned real estate, and employed workers. This wasn't gender equality by modern standards, but it was remarkably progressive for the ancient world. Education in Babylon was highly valued, though restricted largely to the upper classes. The Babylonians invented one of the world's first writing systems, cuneiform, adapted from the earlier Sumerian script. Learning to write cuneiform was incredibly difficult, requiring years of study. There were over 600 basic symbols, each representing either a syllable or an entire word, and the context determined which. Students attended scribal schools called edubah, literally tablet house, where they spent years copying texts, learning mathematics, studying astronomy, memorizing literature. The curriculum was rigorous and demanding. Students worked from dawn to dusk, and corporal punishment was common for those who failed to meet standards. But what they learned was extraordinary. Babylonian mathematics was sophisticated enough to solve quadratic equations. They understood the Pythagorean theorem over 1,000 years before Pythagoras. They could calculate compound interest, divide inheritances according to complex legal requirements, and survey land with impressive accuracy. Their number system was base 60,
which is why we still have 60 seconds in a minute and 60 minutes in an hour. They divided the circle into 360 degrees. These weren't random choices, they were based on sophisticated astronomical observations and mathematical reasoning. Babylonian astronomy was perhaps their greatest intellectual achievement. They observed the night sky with an intensity and precision that wouldn't be matched until the invention of the telescope. They tracked the movements of planets, creating mathematical models to predict their positions years in advance. They identified and cataloged over 1,000 stars. They understood that planets moved in regular patterns, that eclipses could be predicted, that the year was approximately 365 days long. They created star catalogs, astronomical diaries recording nightly observations, and mathematical tables for calculating celestial events. Why this obsession with the stars? Partly religion. The Babylonians believed that the gods communicated through celestial signs, but also something more profound. They recognized patterns, cycles, regularities in what seemed like chaos. They understood that knowledge of these patterns conferred power, the power to plant crops at optimal times, to predict floods, to impress and intimidate neighbors with seemingly prophetic knowledge. Babylonian astronomers were consulted before major decisions, before wars, before marriages, before construction projects. Their predictions carried weight because they were often accurate, based not on superstition, but on centuries of careful observation and mathematical analysis. The economy of Babylon operated with surprising sophistication. Silver functioned as currency, weighed out for each transaction. Banks, run by wealthy families and temples, accepted deposits, made loans, and transferred funds between cities. Interest rates were regulated by law, though typically around 20% annually. Business partnerships were formalized in written contracts, specifying each partner's contribution and share of profits. Companies existed that lasted generations, passing from father to son. There were corporations, groups of investors pooling resources for major ventures like long-distance trade expeditions.
Trade was the lifeblood of Babylon's economy. The city sat at the crossroads of major trade routes, connecting the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean, the mountains of Anatolia to the deserts of Arabia. Caravans arrived daily, carrying cedar from Lebanon, copper from Cyprus, tin from Afghanistan, lapis lazuli from distant Bactria, ivory from Africa, gold from Egypt. Babylonian merchants were famous throughout the ancient world for their honesty and business acumen. A contract signed in Babylon was honored in distant lands because Babylonian merchants understood something fundamental. Reputation was more valuable than any single transaction's profit. The markets of Babylon were sensory overload zones where anything could be purchased. There were spices from India, silk from China, slaves from every corner of the known world. There were craftsmen selling jewelry, pottery, textiles, and metalwork. There were food stalls offering bread, dates, fish, meat, beer. Babylon was famous for its beer, which wasn't the alcoholic beverage we know today, but a nutritious drink made from fermented barley, often consumed instead of water, which could be unsafe. The Babylonians had over 20 different beer recipes, each brewed for different occasions and purposes. Beer was so important that it was used to pay workers, part of the standard daily wage. But Babylon wasn't just commerce and administration. It was a cultural powerhouse that influenced civilizations for thousands of years. The Epic of Gilgamesh, one of humanity's oldest surviving literary works, was written in Babylon. This wasn't a simple adventure story. It was a profound meditation on mortality, friendship, the meaning of life, and the futility of seeking immortality. Gilgamesh, the king of nearby Uruk, was a real historical figure, but the epic transformed him into something mythological, exploring universal human themes that still resonate today. The flood story in Gilgamesh predates and likely influenced the biblical Noah's flood, just one example of how Babylonian culture spread throughout the ancient world. The Babylonians loved music, and their temples and palaces echoed with sounds from lyres, harps, drums, and flutes.
Musicians held respected positions in society, and musical education was part of scribal training. They had musical notation, ways of writing down compositions so they could be performed by future generations. Some of these notations have survived on clay tablets, though deciphering them into actual melodies remains challenging. What we do know is that Babylonian music influenced Greek music, which influenced Roman music, which eventually influenced all of Western music. When you hear a major scale, you're hearing mathematics that Babylonian musicians first formalized. Medicine in Babylon combined practical observation with religious ritual, and the results were surprisingly effective. Babylonian physicians knew hundreds of medicinal plants and their applications.
They could set broken bones, perform basic surgery, treat wounds, deliver babies, and diagnose diseases. They understood that cleanliness prevented infection, that certain plants reduced pain, that some conditions were contagious. Medical texts on clay tablets describe symptoms and treatments in detail, showing a systematic approach to healing. However, they also believed disease had spiritual causes, so treatment combined medicine with prayers, incantations, and rituals. From our modern perspective, this seems contradictory, but for the Babylonians, physical and spiritual health were inseparable. The legal system of Babylon was complex and sophisticated. Courts operated at multiple levels, from local neighborhood councils handling minor disputes to royal courts dealing with major crimes. Judges were appointed officials, trained in law, expected to be impartial. Trials required evidence. Witnesses were examined and cross-examined, and verdicts had to be justified in writing. The concept of precedent existed. Previous cases influenced current decisions. Written contracts were enforceable in court. False accusers faced the same punishment their victim would have received if found guilty, a powerful deterrent against frivolous lawsuits. The punishments specified in Hammurabi's Code strike us as harsh, and many were. Death penalty offenses included certain types of theft, adultery, and false testimony in capital cases. Physical mutilation was prescribed for some crimes. However, context matters. For minor offenses, fines were standard. Most property crimes resulted in restitution, not execution. The death penalty was reserved for crimes that threatened social order. And crucially, punishments were proportional and predictable. You knew in advance what would happen if you broke the law. This was revolutionary. In many ancient societies, punishment depended entirely on the ruler's mood. The social structure of Babylon was hierarchical, but not rigidly fixed. At the top were the king and royal family. Below them came nobles, major landowners, high priests, and wealthy merchants. The middle class included scribes, skilled craftsmen, merchants, and priests. The lower class consisted of farmers, laborers, and soldiers. At the bottom were slaves. Though slavery in Babylon wasn't like later slavery in Greece or Rome. Many slaves were debt slaves who had sold themselves or family members to pay off debts and would eventually be freed. Some slaves owned property, ran businesses, and even owned slaves themselves. Manumission was common, and freed slaves could achieve high social status. Social mobility existed. A talented scribe from a poor family could rise to become a royal administrator. A successful merchant could buy land and nobility. The system rewarded competence and achievement, not just birth. This created a dynamic, ambitious society where people believed hard work and intelligence could change their circumstances. It also meant Babylon attracted talented people from across the known world, immigrants seeking opportunities unavailable in their homelands. Religion permeated every aspect of Babylonian life, though not in ways we might expect. The Babylonians were polytheistic, worshipping dozens of major gods and hundreds of minor deities. Each god had specific responsibilities, personality traits, and preferences. Marduk, the patron god of Babylon, was king of the gods. But even he wasn't omnipotent. The gods could be bargained with, negotiated with, even manipulated through proper rituals. They weren't always moral or just. They had favorites, held grudges, and made mistakes. In many ways, they were like humans, just vastly more powerful. The New Year festival, called Akitu, was Babylon's most important religious celebration, lasting 11 days. It combined religious ritual, political theater, and civic renewal. The king would leave his palace, travel to a temple outside the city walls, and ritually humble himself before Marduk's statue. Priests would strike him on the cheek, pull his ears, and make him kneel while reciting a prayer of submission. Only after this ritual humiliation would he be symbolically recrowned, renewing his divine mandate to rule. This ceremony, repeated annually, reminded everyone, including the king, that power came from the gods and could be withdrawn. During Akitu, the creation myth was publicly recited, the Enuma Elish, telling how Marduk defeated the chaos goddess Tiamat and created the world from her body. This wasn't just entertainment, it was cosmic renewal, ritually ensuring that order would triumph over chaos for another year. Processions carried statues of gods through the streets. Citizens participated in feasts, contests, and celebrations. Social boundaries temporarily dissolved. Masters served slaves. Rich and poor celebrated together. It was cathartic, joyful, and deeply meaningful. But Babylon's golden age, like all golden ages, couldn't last forever. The city's wealth and power made it a target. The Hittites sacked Babylon around 1500 BC, though they couldn't hold it. The Kassites ruled for centuries afterward, maintaining Babylonian culture but adding little new. The city declined, revived, declined again. Assyria conquered Babylon repeatedly, sometimes destroying it, sometimes rebuilding it, always struggling to control this wealthy, rebellious city that refused to accept subordination. Then came Nebuchadnezzar II, who ruled from 604 to 562 BC. He wasn't the first king named Nebuchadnezzar, but he would be the one history remembered. He took a city that had been repeatedly destroyed and rebuilt it on a scale that surpassed even its ancient glory. He expanded the walls, rebuilt the temples, constructed palaces, and created one of the ancient world's 7 wonders, the Hanging Gardens. These gardens, built for his homesick Median wife who missed the green mountains of her homeland, were terraced gardens rising hundreds of feet, filled with trees, flowers, and fountains. Water was lifted from the Euphrates through a sophisticated system of screws and pumps, an engineering marvel that amazed ancient visitors. Nebuchadnezzar's Babylon was likely the largest city the world had yet seen, possibly housing over 300,000 people. It was certainly the wealthiest, controlling trade routes and tribute from conquered peoples. It was cosmopolitan, home to dozens of ethnicities, languages, and religions. Jewish exiles lived in Babylon. Though they called it exile, many prospered. The Book of Psalms speaks of weeping by Babylon's rivers, but archaeological evidence shows Jewish communities thriving, engaging in business, preserving their culture while adapting to their new home. But Nebuchadnezzar's successors were weak, and Babylon's end came not through slow decline, but sudden conquest. In 539 BC, Cyrus the Great of Persia approached Babylon. His army was impregnable, its supplies sufficient for years of siege. Cyrus couldn't breach the walls, so he did something audacious. He diverted the Euphrates River, which flowed through the city under the walls. When the water level dropped, Persian soldiers waded through the riverbed and entered Babylon without a battle. According to some accounts, the city was celebrating a festival, and the conquest happened before most citizens realized what was occurring.
Cyrus treated Babylon with respect, perhaps understanding that destroying such a city would be like burning a library. He kept its administration, honored its gods, restored temples, and declared himself king of Babylon, not conqueror. For a time, Babylon continued much as before, now part of the Persian Empire, but retaining its character. Alexander the Great later captured Babylon and planned to make it his capital, but he died there in 323 BC, possibly of poisoning, possibly of disease, before implementing his vision. After Alexander's death, Babylon slowly faded. The Seleucids, who inherited this part of Alexander's empire, built a new capital nearby. Babylon's population drifted away. The irrigation systems, which required constant maintenance, fell into disrepair. Without irrigation, the fields turned to desert. Without fields, there was no reason for a city. The buildings were quarried for their bricks, which were used to build other cities. The temples collapsed. Sand covered the ruins. Within a few centuries, Babylon's exact location was forgotten. It became myth, remembered in biblical accounts, Greek histories, and dim legends. For over 2,000 years, Babylon existed only in stories. The Tower of Babel, the Whore of Babylon, the writing on the wall, these biblical images shaped how the West remembered the city, usually as a symbol of pride, corruption, and divine punishment. The reality, the sophisticated, cultured, administratively brilliant city, was forgotten. Rediscovery came in the 19th century, when archaeologists, following ancient descriptions, began excavating in Iraq. What they found astonished them. Babylon wasn't a myth, it was real, and it was magnificent. The Ishtar Gate was excavated and partially reconstructed in Berlin, where it still stuns visitors. Thousands of clay tablets were recovered and deciphered, revealing intimate details of daily life. The foundation of temples, palaces, and walls emerged from the sand. The city that had disappeared from history began to reappear, not in legend, but in fact. What makes Babylon's story so significant isn't just that it was large or wealthy or powerful, it's that it was first megacity, first comprehensive law code, first sophisticated astronomical observations, first major literature, first complex economy with banking, interest, and corporations, first urban planning with zoned neighborhoods, first extensive public works, first to attempt to create a truly multicultural society where diverse peoples could coexist under common laws. Every city we build today, every legal system we create, every commercial transaction we make, every astronomical observation we record contains echoes of Babylon. The Babylonians weren't just building a city, they were inventing urban civilization, creating the template that every subsequent civilization would follow, modify, and adapt. When we use the word cosmopolitan, we're describing what Babylon achieved first. When we say someone is sophisticated, we're using a standard Babylon established. When we divide time into hours, minutes, and seconds, we're using Babylonian mathematics. Yet Babylon remains largely forgotten in popular imagination, overshadowed by Egypt's pyramids, Greece's philosophy, Rome's empire. Perhaps because Babylon came first before writing was common enough to preserve detailed histories. Perhaps because its greatest achievements, administrative systems, and commercial practices are less visually dramatic than temples or monuments. Perhaps because the Bible cast Babylon as the enemy, making it difficult for Western civilization to appreciate what this city accomplished.
But the facts speak clearly. For over 1,000 years, Babylon was the greatest city on earth. It was where humans learned to live together in massive numbers, to create systems that could manage complexity, to build institutions that outlasted individual rulers. It was where we learned that laws could be written down and applied consistently, that trade could be regulated fairly, that knowledge could be systematized and preserved. It was where we looked to the stars and saw not chaos but mathematical patterns, where we looked at rivers and saw not barriers but opportunities, where we looked at clay and saw the material for everything. The ruins of Babylon still exist in Iraq, though modern wars have damaged them. Saddam Hussein built a palace overlooking the site, and later American military forces established bases nearby. Excavation and preservation have been sporadic, hampered by political instability. Much remains buried, waiting for more stable times to be revealed. But what has been uncovered is enough to confirm that Babylon deserves to be remembered not just as a biblical symbol, but as humanity's first great experiment in urban civilization. An experiment that succeeded beyond anything its founders could have imagined, and whose influence continues to shape our world 4,000 years later. As you drift toward sleep, imagine standing on those ancient walls at sunset, looking out over fields of grain stretching to the horizon, watching the Euphrates flow through the heart of the city, hearing the calls to prayer from dozens of temples, smelling bread baking in thousands of ovens, feeling the cool evening breeze after the brutal heat of day. Imagine the confidence of living in a city that had stood for centuries and seemed likely to stand forever, protected by walls that had never been breached, governed by laws that applied to everyone, enriched by trade that connected the entire known world. Imagine being part of something greater than yourself, a civilization that was pushing human potential to limits never before reached, where knowledge was growing, where the future seemed bright with possibility. That was Babylon. Not a myth, not a cautionary tale, but humanity's first megacity, the place where we learned that humans could build something lasting, something magnificent, something worthy of the gods themselves. The city that gave us law, literature, astronomy, mathematics, urban planning, and the confidence to believe that human civilization could endure. The Babylon no one talks about, but everyone should remember. Let us walk deeper into the daily rhythms of this extraordinary city, into the lives of the people who made Babylon breathe and pulse with energy. Morning in Babylon began before dawn, when the intense heat of the Mesopotamian summer was still hours away. The first to wake were the bakers, their ovens already glowing with fire fed by dried reeds and animal dung. Bread was the foundation of every meal, and Babylonian bakers produced dozens of varieties. There was flatbread for the poor, ring-shaped bread for offerings, honey-sweetened bread for the wealthy, and bread mixed with dates, sesame seeds, or herbs. The smell of baking bread would drift through the streets, mingling with the smoke from thousands of hearths being rekindled for the day.
Water carriers began their rounds at first light, hauling clay jars from the public cisterns and wells to homes throughout the city. Despite Babylon's sophisticated canal system, most houses didn't have running water. Fresh water was a daily necessity, purchased from professional water carriers who knew every street and alley. These weren't simple laborers, but respected tradesmen who maintained complex delivery routes, remembered which families needed water on which days, and could be trusted to enter homes when residents were away. Some water carriers had worked the same routes for decades, becoming fixtures of their neighborhoods, knowing everyone's business, serving as informal news networks.
Water carriers began their rounds at first light, hauling clay jars from the public cisterns and wells to homes throughout the city. Despite Babylon's sophisticated canal system, most houses didn't have running water. Fresh water was a daily necessity, purchased from professional water carriers who knew every street and alley. These weren't simple laborers, but respected tradesmen who maintained complex delivery routes, remembered which families needed water on which days, and could be trusted to enter homes when residents were away. Some water carriers had worked the same routes for decades, becoming fixtures of their neighborhoods, knowing everyone's business, serving as informal news networks.
In the neighborhoods where craftsmen worked, the sounds of industry filled the air. Metalworkers hammered copper and bronze, creating tools, weapons, jewelry, and vessels. The techniques were sophisticated, involving casting, forging, embossing, and inlay work. Babylonian metalwork was prized throughout the ancient world for its quality and artistry.
Potters shaped clay on wheels that were among the fastest in the ancient world, their feet powering the rotation while their hands transformed shapeless lumps into bowls, jars, plates, and cups. After drying, these vessels were fired in kilns that reached temperatures over 1,000 degrees, hot enough to vitrify the clay into stone-like hardness. Textile workers, many of them women, operated in workshops that could employ dozens of people. They processed flax into linen, the most common fabric, going through the labor-intensive steps of retting flax stalks, beating out the fibers, combing them straight, spinning them into thread, and finally weaving the thread into cloth. Wool processing was equally complex, requiring shearing, cleaning, carding, spinning, and weaving. The best wool came from sheep raised in the northern mountains, where cooler temperatures produced denser fleeces. Dyers created vibrant colors from plants, minerals, and insects. Red came from madder root, blue from woad or expensive imported indigo, yellow from saffron or turmeric, purple from murex snails that were worth more than their weight in silver. Jewelers worked with gold, silver, precious stones, and semi-precious materials like carnelian, agate, and lapis lazuli. Lapis lazuli, a deep blue stone flecked with gold pyrite, came from mines in Afghanistan over 1,500 miles away, traveling along trade routes that crossed mountains, deserts, and rivers. That such a stone was common in Babylon speaks to the sophistication of ancient trade networks. Jewelers created necklaces, earrings, rings, bracelets, and ornamental pins using techniques like granulation, where tiny gold spheres were fused to a gold surface, creating textured patterns. These weren't crude ornaments, but refined works of art that would impress modern jewelers. The temples operated as more than religious centers. They were universities, hospitals, banks, and social service organizations. Each major temple employed hundreds of people in various capacities. There were priests and priestesses performing daily rituals, maintaining the god's statue, preparing offerings, and conducting ceremonies. There were scribes keeping meticulous records of temple property, income, and expenditures. There were accountants tracking loans and investments. There were farmers working temple-owned estates. There were brewers, bakers, weavers, and craftsmen producing goods for temple use or sale. The temples owned perhaps a third of all cultivated land in Babylonia and were among the largest employers in the empire.
Temple education produced most of the scribes, accountants, and administrators who kept Babylonian society functioning. Students began young, often as early as 5 or 6 years old, though only boys from families wealthy enough to afford years of education without their labor. The curriculum started with basic literacy, copying simple texts repeatedly until muscle memory took over and the hand could form cuneiform signs automatically. Then came vocabulary lists, thousands of words organized by category: plants, animals, stones, tools, professions, everything a literate person might need to reference. Mathematical training followed, starting with basic arithmetic and progressing to geometry, algebra, and practical problems involving construction, surveying, and commerce. Advanced students studied literature, memorizing classics like the Epic of Gilgamesh, the Enuma Elish creation myth, and collections of proverbs and wisdom sayings. They analyzed legal documents, learning to draft contracts, wills, and court pleadings. They studied astronomy, learning to identify stars and planets, calculate their movements, and interpret their significance. The best students might become temple scribes or royal administrators, positions of prestige and comfort. Average students found work as commercial scribes, accountants, or teachers. Even a mediocre education opened doors unavailable to the illiterate. The judicial system operated daily in courthouses attached to temples and palaces. Cases ranged from petty disputes over property boundaries to serious criminal charges. Judges listened to both parties, examined evidence, questioned witnesses, and consulted written law codes before rendering verdicts. Trials were public, anyone could observe, ensuring transparency. Verdicts were written and sealed, becoming permanent records.
Appeals were possible, with higher courts reviewing lower court decisions. The system wasn't perfect. Wealth and social status influenced outcomes, but it was systematic, based on rules rather than arbitrary power. Contract law in Babylon was highly developed, covering virtually every type of transaction. There were contracts for sales of land, houses, slaves, and goods. There were partnership agreements specifying each party's contributions and shares of profit or loss. There were loan agreements detailing principal, interest rate, repayment schedule, and collateral. There were employment contracts setting wages, working conditions, and duration of service. There were marriage contracts specifying dowries, property rights, and divorce terms. Every significant transaction was documented, witnessed, and sealed, creating a paper trail that protected all parties and reduced disputes.
The institution of slavery in Babylon was complex and varied. Some slaves were prisoners of war, captured in military campaigns and sold in slave markets. Others were debt slaves, people who had sold themselves or family members to pay off debts. Still others were born into slavery, children of slaves who inherited their parents' status. However, slaves weren't mere property without rights. They could own property, engage in business, marry free persons with their master's permission, and save money to purchase their freedom. Many slaves lived in their own homes, worked at trades, and paid their masters a portion of their earnings rather than laboring under direct supervision.
Manumission, the freeing of slaves, was common and could happen in various ways. A slave might purchase freedom after saving sufficient money. A master might free a loyal slave in his will. Parents sometimes freed children born to slave mothers. Once freed, former slaves faced no legal discrimination and could rise to positions of responsibility. Some freed slaves became wealthy, owning businesses and even slaves of their own. This fluidity meant slavery wasn't the absolute degradation it would become in later societies. It was often temporary, sometimes voluntary, and didn't necessarily preclude dignity or hope. Military service was required of most adult men, though the wealthy could hire substitutes. Babylonian armies combined professional soldiers with militia called up for campaigns. Soldiers received land grants in exchange for military service, creating a class of farmer soldiers who worked their fields during peacetime and fought during wars. Equipment standards were specified by law. Infantry carried spears, axes, swords, and shields. Archers used powerful composite bows made from wood, horn, and sinew laminated together, capable of penetrating armor at distances over 100 yards. Chariots, drawn by horses or onagers, carried noble warriors who fought from mobile platforms. Military campaigns followed agricultural rhythms, beginning after spring planting and ending before fall harvest, when soldiers needed to return to their farms. Campaigns rarely lasted more than a few months, making extended sieges impractical. Armies moved surprisingly fast, covering 20 to 30 miles per day on good roads. Logistics were sophisticated, with supply trains carrying food, water, weapons, and siege equipment. Scribes accompanied armies, recording conquests, casualties, and booty, creating permanent records of military history. When Babylon went to war, it was usually to control trade routes, capture resources, or punish rebellion. The goal wasn't genocide or total destruction, but dominance and tribute. Conquered cities that submitted were treated relatively well, allowed to keep their local rulers, religion, and customs, as long as they paid taxes and supplied troops when demanded. Cities that resisted faced harsher treatment, walls demolished, leaders executed, populations deported. This combination of generosity to the compliant and severity to the resistant was effective. Most cities chose submission over destruction. The role of omens and divination in Babylonian decision-making cannot be overstated. Before any major decision, whether military, political, or personal, omens were consulted. Specialists examined sheep livers, looking for irregularities that indicated divine will. They observed birds, noting their species, flight direction, and behavior. They interpreted dreams,
having codified systems linking dream imagery to future events. They watched for unusual occurrences, animals acting strangely, unexpected weather, celestial phenomena. All these signs were recorded, analyzed, and used to predict outcomes and guide decisions. This wasn't simple superstition. Babylonian divination was based on centuries of observations, recording what signs preceded what outcomes. It was an early form of probability analysis, assuming that patterns observed in the past would repeat in the future. A liver with certain characteristics might have preceded military victory in 20 previous cases and defeat in only 5, making it a favorable omen for war. A particular dream might have preceded business success in 30 cases and failure in 10, making it a favorable omen for a commercial venture. The system was rational within its own framework, based on empirical observation, even if the underlying theory was flawed.
The position of women in Babylon, while subordinate to men, offered more rights and opportunities than in many ancient societies. Wealthy women could become priestesses of various ranks. The highest rank, the N2 priestess of the moon god, was typically a royal princess who wielded considerable religious and economic power. Lower-ranking priestesses performed temple rituals, managed temple properties, and educated young women. Some priestesses were required to remain celibate, others could marry, and some ran what amounted to sacred brothels, where ritual sexual intercourse honored the goddess Ishtar. Women could own and manage property independently. A woman's dowry remained her property throughout marriage, and she could dispose of it as she wished. If divorced, she took her dowry with her. Widows inherited a portion of their husband's estate, enough to support themselves and young children. Women could make wills, appear in court, testify in trials, and bring lawsuits. They could engage in business, lending money, buying and selling property, and entering into partnerships. Several clay tablets record successful businesswomen who operated independently, employing workers and managing complex commercial enterprises. However, these freedoms had limits. Women couldn't hold political office or serve as judges. Their testimony in court carried less weight than men's. A woman's sexuality was more strictly controlled than a man's. Adultery by a married woman was a capital offense, while a married man's adultery was only illegal if the other woman was married. Prostitution was legal and common, but prostitutes occupied a low social status and faced restrictions on their dress and behavior. Society was patriarchal, men held most power, but women weren't simply chattel. They had recognized legal personhood and economic agency. Marriage in Babylon was primarily an economic arrangement between families, though affection and compatibility mattered. Marriages were negotiated by parents, with the groom's family paying a bride price to the bride's family, and the bride's family providing a dowry. The bride price compensated the bride's family for losing her labor, while the dowry provided the bride with security. If divorced through no fault of her own, she kept her dowry. If she initiated divorce without cause, she might forfeit part or all of it. Weddings were celebrated with feasts, music, and ceremonies that could last several days for wealthy families. Divorce was legally recognized and relatively common. A man could divorce his wife for barrenness, though he had to return her dowry. A woman could divorce her husband for abuse, neglect, or failure to support her. If a marriage produced no children, a couple might adopt, or the wife might offer her slave to her husband as a surrogate mother. Children born to a slave concubine could be legitimized and inherit alongside children born to the wife. These arrangements were formalized in written contracts, specifying everyone's rights and responsibilities. Childhood in Babylon varied drastically by social class. Wealthy children were pampered, educated, and prepared for lives of privilege. Poor children began working young, learning their parents' trades, contributing to family survival. All children played, and archaeologists have found toys, clay animals, wooden dolls, spinning tops, balls, and board games. Some games were purely recreational, others taught skills or reflected adult activities. Life expectancy was low by modern standards, perhaps 30 to 40 years on average, but this was largely due to high infant mortality. People who survived childhood often lived into their 50s or 60s.
Healthcare combined practical medicine with religious ritual. Physicians, called asu, diagnosed diseases, prescribed treatments, set bones, stitched wounds, and performed minor surgeries. They used hundreds of plant-based medicines, some of which modern analysis has shown to have genuine therapeutic effects. Willow bark for pain relief, garlic for infections, honey for wound treatment, these weren't superstitions, but effective remedies. However, physicians also believed demons caused many diseases, so treatment included incantations, amulets, and rituals to expel evil spirits. A patient might receive both herbal medicine and an exorcism, addressing disease's physical and spiritual dimensions simultaneously. Medical texts written on clay tablets describe symptoms with impressive precision, allowing modern doctors to diagnose ancient diseases. We can identify tuberculosis, malaria, epilepsy, various intestinal parasites, arthritis, cataracts, and many other conditions from Babylonian descriptions. Treatment protocols were specified. If treatment A fails, try treatment B. If that fails, try treatment C. This systematic approach suggests a medicine based on accumulated experience rather than pure guesswork. Success rates were probably low compared to modern medicine, but they weren't zero. Some people got better, and physicians learned which treatments worked more often than others. The palace complex in Babylon was a city within the city, covering hundreds of acres, surrounded by its own walls, containing administrative offices, residences for royal family and officials, storerooms, workshops, and gardens. The king's daily routine was highly ritualized, beginning with morning prayers and offerings, continuing through audiences where he heard petitions and rendered judgments, meetings with advisors to discuss state affairs, and ceremonial duties. The king was head of state, supreme judge, military commander, chief priest, and living intermediary between gods and humans. The position combined executive, judicial, religious, and military authority in one person. Royal succession was usually hereditary, from father to son, but not automatically. A king could designate any son as heir, not necessarily the eldest. Some kings were succeeded by brothers or other relatives. Succession disputes sometimes led to civil wars with competing claimants battling for the throne. Once established, a new king would perform ceremonies legitimizing his rule, receiving the symbols of kingship, reciting the proper prayers, making offerings to all major gods. These ceremonies weren't empty ritual. They were the process by which a man became something more than human, transformed into the earthly representative of divine authority. The royal court was a place of intrigue, ambition, and danger. Nobles competed for the king's favor, which could bring wealth, power, and prestige. They formed factions, made alliances, and plotted against rivals. The king relied on a complex network of spies and informants to monitor his nobles, preventing conspiracies before they matured. Paranoia was rational. Several Babylonian kings were assassinated by courtiers or family members. Trust was rare, loyalty was purchased, and everyone understood that favor could evaporate instantly. Royal inscriptions, carved on stone monuments or written on clay cylinders buried in building foundations, provide our primary sources for political history. Kings boasted of their conquests, building projects, piety, and justice. These inscriptions were propaganda, intended to impress gods and humans with the king's greatness. They exaggerated victories, minimized defeats, and attributed all success to divine favor. However, they weren't pure fiction. They had to be believable to contemporaries who knew whether the king had actually conquered a city or built a temple.
Cross-referencing royal inscriptions from different kingdoms allows historians to reconstruct events with reasonable accuracy.
Music and entertainment were integral to Babylonian culture. Professional musicians performed at temples, palaces, and private celebrations. Instruments included lyres with up to 11 strings, harps, lutes, drums, tambourines, cymbals, and various flutes and pipes. Musicians underwent years of training, learning to play instruments, sing, and, in some cases, compose. Some musicians specialized in certain types of music, such as religious hymns, work songs, love songs, or funeral laments. Music accompanied most religious ceremonies, creating emotional atmosphere and honoring the gods. Banquets among the wealthy featured elaborate entertainment. There were musicians, dancers, acrobats, and storytellers. The food was abundant and varied, including roasted meats, fish dishes, vegetable stews, fresh fruits, pastries with honey and dates, and copious beer and wine. Guests reclined on cushions, eating with their hands from shared platters, while servants kept cups filled and platters replenished. Conversations ranged from politics to business to philosophy, and a successful banquet enhanced the host's reputation. These weren't just social events, but networking opportunities where deals were made, alliances formed, and information exchanged. Literature in Babylon included myths, epics, hymns, prayers, wisdom literature, and love poetry. The Epic of Gilgamesh stands out as the most sophisticated, a 12-tablet narrative exploring profound themes. Gilgamesh, king of Uruk, begins as a tyrant who abuses his power. The gods create Enkidu, a wild man, to challenge him. After a great fight, they become friends and embark on adventures, killing monsters and offending gods. When Enkidu dies as divine punishment, Gilgamesh is devastated and becomes obsessed with escaping death. He journeys to the ends of the earth seeking immortality, eventually learning that death is inevitable and humans must find meaning in life itself, in building things that endure, in being remembered for great deeds. This story resonates across millennia because it addresses universal human concerns: friendship, mortality, the search for meaning, the limits of power. Gilgamesh's transformation from tyrant to wise king mirrors the maturation every person undergoes. His failure to escape death reminds us that some limits cannot be transcended. His final acceptance of mortality and commitment to building a great city suggests that legacy, not personal immortality, is what humans can achieve. The epic influenced later literature. Elements appear in Homer's works, in the Bible, in countless later stories about heroes seeking what cannot be found and learning wisdom through failure. Proverbs and wisdom sayings were collected and copied by scribes, used in education and quoted in daily life. Many sound surprisingly modern. A sweet word is a man's treasure. He who has walked with a wise man becomes wise himself. A scribe who does not know Sumerian, what kind of scribe is he? These sayings distilled practical wisdom, observations about human nature, advice for successful living. They weren't commandments from gods, but human observations about what works and what doesn't, accumulated over generations.
Love poetry, some of it quite erotic, celebrated physical and emotional aspects of romantic love. These poems, often framed as sacred marriage rituals honoring Ishtar, described lovers' beauty, longing during separation, joy in reunion, and satisfaction in intimacy. They're remarkably frank, describing sexual acts in poetic but unmistakable language. This frankness shocks modern readers accustomed to ancient cultures being prudish, but Babylonians saw sexuality as a natural, divine gift to be celebrated, not hidden or shamed. As evening approached and the intense heat began to fade, Babylon transformed. People who had retreated indoors during the afternoon emerged. Families gathered for evening meals, friends met in taverns for beer and conversation. Musicians played in public squares, vendors lit oil lamps and continued selling into the night.
The city that had seemed sluggish at midday came alive with energy. Evening was the social time, when work ended and leisure began. The night sky in ancient Babylon, unpolluted by artificial light, displayed stars with a brilliance we can barely imagine today. The Milky Way stretched across the heavens like a glowing river. Planets moved among the fixed stars, mysterious wanderers whose positions mattered greatly. Babylonian astronomers worked through the night, recording observations, making calculations, searching for patterns. Their dedication produced datasets spanning centuries, making possible the discovery of astronomical cycles and the development of mathematical models to predict celestial events. As night deepened, most people slept, but the city never fully rested. Guards patrolled the walls and streets. Bakers prepared bread for morning. Priests performed midnight rituals in temples. Pregnant women went into labor and midwives rushed to assist them. The sick suffered through long nights, comforted by family members. Young lovers met in secret. Thieves prowled looking for opportunities. Life continued in darkness as it did in light, the eternal rhythm of a great city.
And so Babylon endured, day after day, year after year, century after century. Powered by human labor, guided by human intelligence, sustained by human ambition. It was never perfect. It had poverty alongside wealth, injustice alongside law, cruelty alongside compassion. But it worked. It allowed hundreds of thousands of people to live together, to cooperate, to create something greater than any individual could achieve alone. When we remember Babylon, we should remember it as the place where humanity learned to build cities, create laws, record knowledge, and dream of greatness. It was the first, and in being first, it showed us what was possible. Every city since has learned from Babylon, whether consciously or unconsciously. Every legal code since has echoes of Hammurabi. Every astronomical observation since stands on foundations laid by Babylonian star watchers. Every piece of literature since owes something to the Epic of Gilgamesh. Babylon fell, as all cities must, but what it created did not fall. It spread, transformed, adapted, and lives on in every urban center, every written law, every commercial transaction, every observation of the night sky. The city may be ruins, but its legacy is civilization itself.